Okay, welcome to the lecture Intimacy and the Evolution of Technology. The information in this lecture comes from an article by Alessandro Tomasi called The Role of Intimacy in the Evolution of Technology, and it was published in the Journal of Evolution and Technology in January 2008. I have attached the article with the lecture. I do not expect you to read it, but it's there if you want to. It's kind of long. It's difficult to unpack, and so I'm kind of trying to do the work of unpacking it to help it make sense to you in this lecture. Okay, I just want to begin with this quotation from Tomasi. Without desire, there is no need of a scheming mind, devising tools to possess an object. I want you to just keep this quote in mind as you listen to this lecture, but also as you watch the 2 episodes of Black Mirror that we're looking at, the entire history of you, and be right back. All right, so you already know that there's a difference between humans and animals and plants and minerals. And so I want to elaborate on this difference to try to help you understand the definition of intimacy that we're dealing with here. We are not dealing with intimacy in terms of closeness, the kind of closeness that we might experience in a romantic relationship. Although erotic experience is tied in with what we're talking about here, and that will become clear later on in the lecture. So to just sort of distinguish between these 3 levels of intimacy, the first is known as immanence, and this is the essential quality of a continuity and flow from being to being, uninterrupted by a discriminating consciousness or even a sentiment of self. So what does this mean? Things like inorganic matter, so that mineral that I just showed you, has no sense of self, no consciousness to distinguish it from anything else. Therefore, it is complicit with the rest of the universe. It has continuity. Animals have a type of immanence. It's called relationships of immanence. And because of the necessity of nutrition, animals have to develop relationships with the world around them. So there's some distinction between the animal and, say, the land where the animal might graze. And there is some sentiment of self there, but there isn't the same kind of distance from creation that humans experience. Animals don't necessarily anticipate the future in the same way that we do, and they also don't really have a sense of dread about death. Even though they may fear predators, their sense of the future and their sense of death is not the same, at least as far as we know. It's not the same as our own. And it's important to distinguish, I think, to just kind of go back to regular immanence with inorganic matter, that being doesn't necessarily mean alive in the sense that you and I are alive, or that animals are alive, that inanimate objects and inorganic matter have being, they exist. And so that's how that word is being used there. Okay, but again, inorganic matter experiences absolute intimacy because it lacks the kind of discriminating consciousness that both animals and humans have. And animals have relationships of immanence. So they have a kind of apathy about time and self that seems to be, that characteristic seems to be unique to humans. So here's George Bataille staring at us very intensely. He was a philosopher. He writes a lot about the body and technology and eroticism, not necessarily in terms of it being pornographic or sexual in that way, but sort of what goes on there with human sexuality and erotic experience. And I'm going to touch briefly on that. I don't want to belabor that too much, but some of you, I think you might on your own just draw some connections there as you're watching these episodes of Black Mirror, that sort of what's happening with the relationship between desire, erotic experience, and the types of technologies that we're faced with in these 2 episodes. But essentially, Bataille posits that technology embodies the first act of a consciousness that split the world into subjects and objects. And so because humans created technology, we recognized right away that that rock is not me and I am not that rock. and then therefore I can manipulate this rock to my own ends. And in doing so, we lost that sort of intimacy that both animals and inorganic matter experience with the rest of the cosmos. But we do have what he calls the positing and the non-positional consciousness, the positing consciousness being the one that recognizes the self as separate, and then the non-positional consciousness being the part of our mind and the way that our mind is able to sort of forget that there's a separation between us and the world around us. So this is really important when we get into the sort of what's happening with intimacy and technology. So human intimacy, according to Bataille, is called ataraxia. And from the Greek, this translates to tranquility. So it's kind of important there. But Bataille goes on to describe it a little bit more in detail, saying that the human form of intimacy is a negation of difference. So in situations where we negate the difference between ourselves and something else, we are experiencing ataraxia. All right, and so probably the easiest way to understand that in terms of technology is to think about the total familiarity that we experience with certain objects. And that once we reach this type of familiarity, the object, it's no longer seen as an object anymore. It recedes into the background of our consciousness, and it kind of becomes nothing but an extension of our body. So there are lots of examples of this. I think one of the ones that I think about a lot is when we're driving. We sort of, I think humans tend to not really, we kind of become one with our car. Our car is totally an extension of our own body, our own being. And we're not thinking about the car as we're driving the car, unless it's making some ridiculous racket that draws attention to itself. But there's no real distinction between ourselves as the user of the car and the vehicle itself. And we see, too, that this happens with cell phones, that there's something there that we're not really thinking about the technology itself anymore. It's kind of receded into our consciousness. So I want you to also think about this quote that I have here in the center: no time gets between, and not, that should say no distance divides. I'll have to correct that typo. So no time gets between and no distance divides. And in a sense, that is the absolute intimacy, and we do experience that with certain technologies. And so Bataille suggests that we view technology as a search for this lost intimacy. And Alessandro Tomasi, sort of piggybacking on that argument, argues that it is indeed intimacy that drives our technological evolution. So we do not develop new technologies out of some ethical response to the world, whether the technology is good for us or bad for us. That really has nothing to do with it. Instead, we develop the technology based on how does it work for us, and do we experience intimacy with that technology? Meaning, are we able to adapt it to ourselves in such a way that we no longer really notice its existence? But Tomasi also kind of makes the point that as soon as we kind of get familiar and we start to experience an intimacy with a particular technology, that we then sort of disrupt that intimacy with a new technology. And he gives a really great example, if I can find it here, of the watch. And he talks about how, we might develop a watch. Let's see, I'll just read it here. So he says the problem is that a new level of intimacy is achieved, that when a new level of intimacy is achieved, new inventions and innovations are made to upset it. And old technology with which we successfully established a relation of intimacy is transcended by a new generation of devices we have to become totally familiar with. Why does humanity need to lose what it seeks as soon as he finds it? And you'll notice I did put this question on the slide because I think it's a really important question to entertain just about human nature, that why we do this, very clearly so, and why is that? And he goes on to say, one obvious answer is that the old devices did not do their job in the best possible way. We can do better, and the criterion for this evaluative judgment is given by the experience of the intimacy itself. Okay, so we think I can do better than carrying around a 100-pound watch, regardless of how precisely it tells time. Such a watch is too visible and massive, too present to fit in and work out in my hand. A better watch would be a smaller one, small enough to disappear as an object of consciousness. And then he poses these questions of how small does it need to be? So small as to be insubstantial is the answer that the experience of intimacy suggests. So we are evolving our technologies so that they become, in a way, invisible to us. That's sort of out of sight, out of mind, and then we just accept it. And so, like, we are, and I always enjoy watching stuff that's dated, like in the 80s when the cell phones were huge. And now, if you think about the short span of time in which our technology has evolved and is getting smaller and smaller and more malleable and more invisible. And as you watch Black Mirror, especially the episode, The Entire History of You, you see directly that the technology that exists in this society there is absolute intimacy. It's a very small implant in the neck of the human being. So there's already merger between body and machine. And yet, and this is what I want you to think about, and it'll be written up in the prompt sheet for this blog post, but what is it that is causing a disruption, though? Because there is this absolute intimacy, and yet something is getting in the way of it. And so that's really what I want us to analyze, is what is preventing the intimacy, the absolute intimacy. And I think in part it lies, that the answer lies in terms of the ethical questions that arise from the experience of that technology. Okay. All right. So in part, the answer here is that we want technologies that satisfy our desire. And what our desire is, we want immediate gratification. We all know this. So I want to know immediately as soon as the will to know arises. And that, in a sense, that's again part of this intimacy, that I don't want to have to experience time and distance in order to find knowledge or an answer or to satisfy my desire. I want it as soon as I want it. And in a sense, all right, so this comes back to Bataille and this idea of the erotic experience, because the erotic experience has the power to deflate our sense of time and space, that we're not consumed with the future or thinking about the past, or even in the present moment. There's a sort of apathy, and that it's sort of like in those moments where we're sort of water living in water. Think about that metaphor for a little while. But Bataille explains it this way. He says, in the embrace, the object of desire is always the totality of being, in the form of she, who in the embrace is its mirror, where we ourselves are reflected. And so that might take a little while to sort of break down and understand. But I think if we go with the way that Tomassi sort of appropriates Bataille's message, Tomassi suggests we can view technology as a way of reaching out, not of controlling. And he writes that this erotic union captures the core meaning of a sovereign technology. That is, of a technology compatible with the idea that the sovereign or the sovereign life begins when the necessities ensured, the possibility of life opens up without limits. And so I want you to just think back on the quote that I just gave you about wanting to know as soon as my will to know arises, if it can be satisfied. And I'm not having to do any sort of work. It's just there. That really what we're aiming for, and by sovereign what we mean here is sort of supreme ruler. And that in a sense, that is where we're headed with our technology. Though it is important to know that it's not this sort of conscious end goal. We're not really evolving our technology according to some future goal. We're evolving our technology according to our present needs. But that if we can kind of now turn to Tomassi's conclusion, which is that it is, in a sense, this type of intimacy that we're trying to achieve. So he agrees with Bataille in that Our technological evolution is fueled by a desire to return to this sort of absolute intimate state where we are continuous beings with the cosmos, and there is no separation between us and nature. And so he concludes, intimacy therefore guides the evolution of technology from start to finish, from the first tool, because of which we lost our animal innocence, to the last transcending leap towards a condition that approximates that of the gods as it is humanly possible. And I find this both terrifying and exciting at the same time. I don't think I will see this sort of, although I don't know because things are rapidly progressing, but to see this sort of technology that could eventually exist to create a sort of completely sovereign being, if you had sort of supreme power over nature and other people around you, it's terrifying, and yet does kind of spur my curiosity, obviously, or I wouldn't have chosen this topic for the semester. But I think what you really want to take from this is that the definition of intimacy that we're looking at here doesn't necessarily have to do with romantic closeness between two people. That instead it has to do with a level of consciousness and self-awareness that disconnects us from the rest of the world. And that we continually break things down into subjects and objects, including ourselves. Our bodies, we have the most intimate relationships with our bodies, where we do not necessarily think about our body as we use it. And yet, at the same time, I can be conscious of my hand as its own object, independent of me, even though it's not independent of me. And in part, this, we see it just in language. So my hand is on the table. I am not on the table. My hand is on the table. And so there's even a separateness between ourselves in this way. So that's what we mean by intimacy. And again, the whole idea here is that if a piece of technology can help us to achieve that experience of intimacy, then we will gladly accept it, whether it is good for us or bad for us. And so I want you to be keeping that in mind, that these societies that we're looking at in the 2 episodes of Black Mirror have technologies that have evolved in response to certain desires. So you can speak freely about the specific desires that those technologies seem to satisfy, but then also think about what is it that doesn't quite fit. That even though the memory implant in the entire history of you is small enough that you don't even really notice it, what is the problem there? Why isn't it fitting in? Why is it allowing ethical questions to come to the surface? And in Be Right Back, the technology we're dealing with there is a little bit different because it's not necessarily widely accepted. There's still a lot of skepticism about it. And yet human curiosity gets the better of the character Martha, and she explores it. And then again, something doesn't quite fit. And so I guess I want us to embrace our discontinuity and our lack of intimacy with technology for a minute and really explore in more depth what is missing, but then also how might these technologies be perfected so that we do achieve absolute intimacy with them and with the world around us. So I know that's a lot to digest, so feel free to listen to the lecture again. And like I said, with the lecture accompanying you, it might help to just kind of glance over the reading. But again, I don't think you need to. I think you just need to kind of spend time thinking about the quotes that I've included on these slides and the things that I've discussed in this lecture. And if you watch the TV shows, it will open up what I'm talking about. You'll start to see it. Without having to really do the work of trudging through the article. Okay, and I'm not expecting you to cite the article in any way. You'll see from the prompt sheet that I do a lot of the citing myself, and I really try to break everything down again to make it easier on you so that you can really focus on sort of digesting the concepts of intimacy that I've talked about here, and then also how that's playing out with the certain types of technologies that we see in Black Mirror. So again, try to have fun with this. Don't get bogged down. I know you all are working on your research papers, and that's really the priority as I see it, but I do want to get this blog post out of the way within the next week or so. And again, 300, 400 word response that sort of provides your reaction to these concepts and those Black Mirror episodes. All right, so as always, please email me if you have questions or concerns, and good luck with this next assignment.